The moment you stop reaching out, something unexpected begins to happen. Not because you're playing games, not because you're trying to make him miss you on purpose, but because silence often reveals things that constant communication keeps hidden. And what he notices during that silence can completely change the way he sees you. Today, we're going to explore exactly what a man notices when you stop reaching out, and why it has much less to do with making him chase you, and much more to do with understanding human behavior, attraction, emotional balance, and self-respect. Because the biggest thing he notices is probably not what most people expect. Have you ever stopped texting someone first and suddenly noticed their behavior change? Maybe they started reaching out more. Maybe they became quieter. Or maybe they showed you exactly how interested they truly were. Think about that for a moment, and as you keep watching, you may recognize a pattern you never noticed before. Stay with me, because the final point often changes the way people look at relationships completely. One of the first things a man notices when you stop reaching out is the shift in energy. People naturally get used to patterns. When someone is always the one starting conversations, checking in, asking how the day went, and keeping the connection moving forward, that effort slowly becomes normal. It feels expected. So when that pattern suddenly changes, it catches attention. The silence is not always painful, but it is different. It interrupts the routine. And that interruption creates awareness. What often becomes clear is not simply your absence, it is the amount of effort you had been putting into the relationship all along. Effort is easy to overlook when it happens every day, but once it disappears, its value becomes impossible to ignore. That realization can make someone stop and think in ways they never did before. Keep watching, because this is only the beginning of what silence can reveal. The next thing he notices is whether he feels the desire to close the distance himself. This is where many people misunderstand attraction. Attraction is not only about feelings, it is also about action. Someone may enjoy your company, but real interest shows up through effort. When you stop reaching out, you create space for him to decide what he wants to do with that space. Will he message you first? Will he call? Will he make an effort to keep the connection alive? Or will he simply let the silence continue? Whatever happens, the answer gives you valuable information. It does not define your value. It simply shows his level of willingness to invest in the relationship, and that kind of honesty is worth far more than guessing or overthinking. Sometimes one small step back gives you clearer answers than months of trying harder. Many people overlook this, but it can completely change the way you see the relationship. He also begins to notice your independence. Real confidence is not about proving that you do not need anyone. It is much quieter than that. It is shown by continuing to enjoy your own life without depending on constant attention from someone else. When you stay focused on your goals, spend time with people you care about, enjoy your hobbies, and continue growing as a person, you send a powerful message without saying a single word. Your happiness is not built around someone else's responses. Your life already has meaning. Healthy relationships grow stronger when two people choose to share full lives instead of expecting one person to become the center of the other's world. That kind of independence stands out because it feels real. It is calm, it is steady, and it naturally creates respect. If this idea is making you think differently already, stay until the end, because the final insight connects everything together in a way many people never consider. Another thing he starts to notice is how much of the relationship was being carried by you. Sometimes neither person realizes how much energy one individual is contributing until that energy is no longer there. Conversations become shorter, the momentum slows down, messages become less frequent, the connection feels different, and suddenly it becomes much easier to see who was creating most of the movement all along. This is not about blaming anyone. Every healthy relationship grows through shared effort. But awareness matters. When you clearly see how the connection functions, you can make wiser decisions about where to invest your time, emotions, and attention. Instead of guessing whether someone cares, you begin to observe their actions. And actions usually tell a much clearer story than words ever can. That clarity may not always feel comfortable, but it gives you something far more valuable than uncertainty. It gives you the truth. He also begins to notice how he genuinely feels about you. A little distance often creates a surprising amount of clarity. When someone is always available, it becomes easy to move through conversations without much thought. Everything feels automatic. But when there is space, reflection naturally begins. He may realize that he misses hearing from you. He may discover that your presence brought more peace and happiness into his life than he understood before. Or he may realize that his feelings were never as deep as he believed. No matter which answer appears, clarity is always better than confusion. Honest understanding allows both people to move forward instead of staying trapped in endless uncertainty. Sometimes silence answers questions that repeated conversations never could. It removes assumptions, it reveals priorities, and it shows what truly matters once the daily routine is gone. That is why stepping back is often about gaining understanding, not creating distance. The biggest thing many men notice when you stop reaching out is your self-respect. Not because you are trying to punish them, not because you want to make them chase you, but because you are quietly showing that a healthy relationship needs effort from both people. Self-respect says, I enjoy talking with you, I care about this connection, but I will not carry the entire relationship alone. That is not pride, it is balance, it is emotional maturity. Strong relationships are never built by one person doing all the work while the other simply receives the benefits. They grow when both people willingly invest their time, attention, and care. Sometimes the greatest lesson silence teaches is not whether someone misses you. It is whether they are ready to meet you with the same energy you have been giving all along. And once you understand that, you stop chasing answers and start recognizing them. That shift changes everything. It helps you choose connections built on mutual respect instead of one-sided effort. And in the end, that is the kind of relationship that has the strongest chance of lasting. That is emotional maturity. And emotionally mature people understand something very important. Healthy relationships grow through balance. Both people show up. Both people invest. Both people continue choosing each other. So if you are wondering what a man notices when you stop reaching out, remember this. He notices the shift in energy. He notices the space that suddenly appears. He notices whether he feels the desire to step closer or stay where he is. He notices your independence. He notices his own emotions more clearly. And most importantly, he notices the standards you have for the way you expect to be treated. The goal was never to make someone run after you. The real goal was to stop running after someone who is not willing to meet you halfway. Because the strongest relationships are not built on one person constantly pursuing the other. They are built on shared effort, shared respect, and shared choice. When two people freely decide to choose each other again and again, that is where genuine connection begins to grow. If this idea is changing the way you see relationships already, stay with me because what comes next explains why one simple change can reveal more than months of constant communication. One of the first things a man notices when you stop reaching out is the change in the emotional rhythm between the two of you. Every relationship follows certain patterns, even when neither person realizes it. Most people do not pay attention to those patterns until something interrupts them. If you have been the one starting conversations, checking in, sending messages, or keeping the connection moving, you quietly create a natural flow. After a while, that flow becomes familiar. It starts to feel normal. It may even become something the other person expects without thinking about it. This does not always mean he does not care. It simply means people naturally get used to consistency. We often stop noticing what is always there. But the moment that familiar pattern changes, attention immediately follows. When you step back and stop reaching out, the routine disappears. The silence stands out because it replaces something that had become predictable. And that simple change creates awareness in a way constant contact often cannot. Keep watching, because this small shift can reveal something surprisingly important. It is a little like sitting in a room with soft music playing in the background. After a while, you barely notice it. But the moment the music stops, the silence suddenly feels different. That is often how emotional patterns work. When your messages are no longer arriving as they used to, something quietly changes inside his mind. He becomes aware that the connection feels different. Even if he cannot explain it right away, there is now a small space between what he expected and what is actually happening. That space naturally gets attention. He may not immediately reach for his phone. He may not instantly react. But inside, he begins noticing the difference. The conversation that once continued almost automatically now depends on whether he is willing to take the next step. And that is where something important begins to happen. Because when we have to make an effort instead of simply responding, we naturally start paying closer attention. Action creates awareness, and awareness often leads to honesty. Stay until the end, because this final idea brings everything together in a way many people overlook. As time passes, he may slowly realize that you were doing more to keep the connection alive than he first understood. That realization does not always arrive as a dramatic, emotional moment. Sometimes it is simply a quiet thought that appears during the day. Maybe he notices you have not texted. Maybe he realizes it has been several days since you last spoke. Maybe he catches himself wondering why things suddenly feel different. Those small thoughts can slowly build into a deeper awareness. The distance itself does not automatically mean he has lost interest. Instead, it often creates space for reflection, and reflection changes the way people see a relationship. He may begin looking at the dynamic from a new perspective without even realizing he is doing it. Your absence quietly highlights the role you were playing all along. In an unexpected way, stepping back can make your contribution easier to recognize than constantly being present ever could. He starts seeing the value of the effort you were giving, not because you demanded appreciation, but because its absence made its importance impossible to ignore. Sometimes silence does not push people away. Sometimes it simply allows the truth to become visible. When you stop reaching out, one of the deeper changes that can happen in his mind is that he starts wondering where he truly stands in your life. This usually does not begin with a dramatic thought like, "Do I still matter to her?" More often, it starts as a quiet curiosity created by the change in your behavior. People naturally rely on small signals to understand where they fit in someone's life, and regular communication is one of the strongest signals of all. When that familiar pattern suddenly disappears, the mind tries to make sense of it. If he has become used to you being the one who starts conversations, checks in, or keeps the connection active, there is often an unspoken expectation that you are emotionally present and interested. Once that expectation changes, his understanding of the relationship may begin to shift. He may quietly wonder if something has changed on your side. Have your priorities moved in a different direction? Are you focusing on other parts of your life? Is he still as important to you as he once believed? These questions are not always driven by insecurity. More often, they are simply the mind trying to understand a new situation after familiar signs disappear. And this is where things become interesting. Stay with me, because the next part explains why this moment often reveals more than people expect. What makes this shift so powerful is that it encourages him to look at his own level of effort. When communication flows easily every day, there is little reason to stop and think about how much each person is contributing. Everything simply continues as usual, but when you step back, maintaining the same connection suddenly requires action from him, and once effort becomes necessary, self-reflection often follows. He may begin asking himself whether he has been giving as much as he believed. He may notice that you were carrying more of the conversations than he realized. He may even recognize that the balance between the two of you was not as equal as it seemed. In many ways, your silence becomes a mirror. It quietly reflects his own actions back to him without arguments, pressure, or emotional speeches. Sometimes people understand the value of consistency only after it is no longer there. And that realization can become the starting point for a completely different way of looking at the relationship. Keep watching, because what happens next depends less on words and more on what his actions reveal. The way he understands your silence often depends on his emotional maturity and his level of interest in the relationship. If he genuinely values the connection, he may see the silence as space rather than rejection. Instead of pulling away, he may feel encouraged to reach out, reconnect, and understand what has changed. If his investment is lower, or if he feels uncertain, he may not rush to close the distance. But even then, he usually notices that something is different. The familiar pattern has been interrupted, and that change still leaves an impression. Either way, your place in his list of priorities becomes much clearer. You move from being someone whose presence was expected to someone whose absence now requires thought. That difference matters because it reveals the truth without forcing it. There is no confrontation, no emotional pressure, no long explanation. The dynamic simply changes enough for him to quietly reassess where you fit into his life and whether he is willing to make the effort needed to keep the connection alive. And very often, that awareness shapes everything that happens next. One of the most meaningful things that happens when you stop reaching out is that you create space. And inside that space, a man may begin to experience the emotional weight of your absence. In everyday life, we often stop noticing things that are always present. When someone is consistently available, their presence naturally blends into the routine of daily life. But once that presence becomes less frequent, even in a small way, the difference becomes much easier to notice. The human mind pays closer attention to change than to repetition. That is why absence can sometimes feel louder than constant presence. At first, he may not think of it as an emotional experience. It could simply begin with noticing fewer messages, fewer notifications, or a break in the normal rhythm of communication. But as time passes, that small gap slowly creates an emotional echo. He becomes aware that something which was once part of his routine is no longer there. And that awareness naturally invites reflection. Stay until the end, because this final point explains why silence can often reveal feelings that constant conversation keeps hidden. As that space continues to grow, the mind naturally begins searching for meaning. When someone who was once consistent becomes quieter, people often wonder why. If there was a genuine emotional connection, the silence gives his thoughts room to move in ways they could not before. He may find himself remembering past conversations, small moments that made him smile, or the comfort that came from hearing from you regularly. This is where emotional awareness often becomes stronger, because contrast reveals value. Your absence does not simply create missing communication, it also highlights the role you quietly played in his emotional world. When you were reaching out, you were part of his daily routine. Once that routine changes, he begins to feel the difference between having that connection and living without it. Even if he never calls it missing you, the emotional contrast is still there. The silence also removes distractions. Without constant messages, deeper feelings have room to rise to the surface. He may realize he wants to reconnect, or he may discover that the distance feels natural. Either response gives him greater clarity about the true importance of the relationship. In many cases, what seems like simple silence from your side becomes a meaningful emotional signal on his side. It quietly reveals what mattered, what was overlooked, and what now feels absent from his everyday life. And that growing awareness often influences whether he chooses to step closer again or quietly lets the distance continue to grow over time. One of the most revealing things that happens when you stop reaching out is that a man begins to see, sometimes for the very first time, the real balance of effort inside the relationship. While communication is flowing naturally, it is easy for both people to believe everything is equal. Messages are exchanged, conversations continue, the connection feels active. But what often stays hidden is who is actually starting those conversations, who keeps the momentum going, and who quietly carries most of the responsibility for keeping the relationship alive. If you have been the one regularly reaching out, you have been creating movement without either of you needing to think about it. The moment you step back, that movement does not simply slow down. It uncovers the pattern that was there all along. If he had become used to your initiative, even without realizing it, he now has to decide whether he wants to keep the connection moving by himself. That small change turns something passive into something active. Instead of only responding, he now has to make a choice, and choices reveal priorities. Stay with me, because this next part explains why that simple shift can completely change how he views the relationship. As soon as the usual pattern changes, awareness naturally begins to grow. He may slowly realize how often he was reacting instead of taking the first step himself. He may notice how comfortable he had become with you carrying much of the emotional effort without either of you talking about it. This understanding usually does not arrive in one dramatic moment. It builds quietly through small observations. He notices that conversations no longer begin on their own. He catches himself thinking about sending a message because the familiar rhythm has disappeared. What once happened automatically now requires intention, and intention has a way of revealing what truly matters. The connection no longer moves forward by habit. It moves only if someone chooses to make it happen. That difference can completely change the way he sees the relationship. Many people never recognize the balance of effort until that balance shifts. If this idea is making sense to you, keep watching, because the next insight often becomes the turning point that brings everything into focus. He may also begin to recognize the steady consistency you brought into the connection. Consistency is one of those things people rarely notice while it is always there. It quietly becomes part of everyday life. But once it is missing, its value becomes much easier to understand. He may realize that you were often the one checking in, creating conversations, asking thoughtful questions, or simply making sure the connection stayed warm. That recognition can slowly reshape the way he sees your role. He starts to understand that your presence was not only about sending messages, it was about the energy you consistently invested. This is where emotional awareness and everyday behavior begin to come together. He notices not only that your texts are gone, but that the emotional support, attention, and momentum you were providing are no longer part of his daily routine. That contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Sometimes people only understand the value of steady effort after they experience life without it, and that awareness often becomes much more powerful than any explanation ever could. For many men, this realization becomes a quiet turning point. He eventually reaches a moment where he has to decide what happens next. He can choose to step into the space you have created and become more intentional with his own effort, or he can remain passive and allow the distance to continue growing. Either choice reveals something meaningful. It shows whether he is willing to invest in the relationship instead of simply benefiting from the effort someone else was providing. In many situations, the silence does not create a new reality. It simply uncovers the one that already existed beneath the surface. And once that truth becomes clear, both people are in a better position to make honest decisions about where the relationship is heading. Keep watching, because the next part explains what often happens inside his emotions once the constant communication slows down and the noise begins to fade. When you stop reaching out, another deeper shift can begin inside his mind. He is often placed into a quieter kind of emotional reflection where he starts noticing how he truly feels without the constant flow of interaction keeping everything moving. During regular communication, emotions can remain close to the surface because there is always another message to answer, another conversation to continue, or another moment to respond to. The connection keeps moving forward, and there is very little time to pause and reflect. But when that movement slows down, something changes. The mind suddenly has more room to think. The silence creates space where distractions used to be. In that space, deeper emotions often become easier to recognize. He may begin to miss the conversations, appreciate the comfort your presence brought, or realize that the connection meant more than he understood while everything felt automatic. On the other hand, he may discover that his feelings are not as strong as he believed. Either outcome brings clarity, and clarity is always more valuable than staying trapped in uncertainty. Sometimes the quiet moments reveal truths that constant conversation keeps hidden. That is why stepping back is not about creating distance. It is often about allowing reality to become impossible to ignore. As the silence continues, feelings often become much easier to notice. At first, it may seem like nothing more than an awareness that something is different. He notices you have not sent a message. He realizes the familiar rhythm has changed. But as time goes on, that absence begins to connect with memory and emotion. The mind naturally returns to experiences that carried emotional meaning, especially when there is less new interaction filling the space. Small conversations that once felt ordinary may suddenly seem more important when viewed in hindsight, simply because they are no longer being replaced by fresh moments together. This is where real clarity begins to grow. Without constant communication, he is no longer reacting to your latest message. Instead, he starts responding to the memory of you and the place you held in his daily life. That shift matters because it allows him to honestly measure the emotional effect you had on him. He may realize that your conversations brought comfort, encouragement, or happiness that he quietly appreciated without fully recognizing it at the time. If this is making sense, stay with me, because the next part explains why silence often reveals feelings that busy conversations keep hidden. On the other hand, that same space can reveal something completely different. If his emotional investment was never very deep, the silence may simply feel like a small change in routine instead of a strong emotional loss. That answer is valuable too because it replaces uncertainty with truth. It helps reveal whether the connection carried genuine emotional meaning or whether it was simply built around convenience and habit. Either result gives greater honesty than constant guessing ever could. Another important part of this process is that distance removes many of the distractions that come with ongoing conversation. When someone is always present, the mind stays focused on replying, reacting, and continuing the interaction. But once communication slows, reflection naturally becomes stronger. He may quietly ask himself whether he actually misses you or whether he simply misses the familiar routine that had become part of his day. Those two feelings can seem almost identical at first, but they lead to very different choices. One points toward real emotional attachment, the other points toward habit. And recognizing that difference can completely change the way he understands the relationship. Keep watching because this final insight brings everything together.